Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
For the past decade, the Opportunity Project has quietly transformed how government tackles big challenges by inviting the public in. Through short, focused development sprints, federal agencies have partnered with technologists, advocates, and entrepreneurs to turn open data into real-world solutions. Joining Federal Drive host Terry Gurdon with reflections on what's worked, what's scalable, and how this model of agile, collaborative problem-solving could shape the future of public service is president and founder of Code, Joel Gurdon.
So what is the Opportunity Project? The Opportunity Project is a very innovative way of using agile development and open government data in a collaborative framework to develop applications, digital products that can be helpful for all different kinds of groups of people at a community level in the real world, is the way I would describe it. It started in 2015, so they're in their 10th year now. It was really inspired by the College Scorecard, which was a terrific project that has really helped parents and students get a sense of the kind of return on investment for different colleges in a very creative way. And then that really demonstrated the power of open government data when it's applied in innovative and creative ways. It then became a White House project in 2016, and then in 2017 became part of the Census Bureau, which is where it is now. And over the years, they've done just some phenomenal work that I'm happy to tell you about.
Let's do that. Tell me about a couple of examples that really stand out to you.
Sure. Well, there have been some great examples, and I would start by just talking about the statistics, which are phenomenal. They've done 79 projects so far, 258 different digital products at last count have come out of that, and they've used more than 450 federal data sets. So they've had the ability to scale, and they've done this really by partnering both with nonprofits, almost always with federal agencies, and also with the tech community in really creative ways. Some of the case studies that we have in the paper really demonstrate their impact. They've done projects on rural economic development that have been very effective. Indigenous communities have become involved in some of their work. They did a big project on credit card marketing. And what really comes to mind for me also is the work they've done in Puerto Rico. They began with a project on federal funding, really trying to track the impact of federal funding across the island. That has led to some continuing work with some of their partners there. And that actually led also to a whole set of projects that are now being done in Puerto Rico using the Opportunity Project model. So it's turned out to be a very scalable model, actually.
One of the things that you mentioned is their ability to work cross-sector, which is pretty unusual. With civil society, with tech innovators, with the government, what is the secret to their success in building those kinds of collaborations?
Well, I think one of the secrets has been that they began, and this was in our 2019 paper that you mentioned, and around that time they were really developing the idea of user representatives and user advocates. So I think around the middle of their 10-year history, they really saw the importance and the value of getting direct engagement with the people from the communities and cities that they were trying to serve. And I think that has made a huge difference. We found in doing research and talking to folks for this updated paper that there's still even more that they could do. But I think that's been part of the secret of their success. They've developed a real model for working with the tech community and bringing in experts in ways that are time effective for them and enable them to make a contribution. And they've worked with all kinds of NGOs, as you said, Policy Link, National League of Cities, many others. But I think more than anything, taking that user-focused perspective and really building that into the process in a formal way has been critical and very effective.
I'm speaking with Joel Gurdon. He's the president and founder of Code. So, Joel, when you think about the Opportunity Project, what are lessons that federal agencies could learn in general about the kind of work that it does, how it does its work, and maybe even more importantly, how it communicates its work?
Yeah, thank you. I think those are great questions. Well, one thing I would point out is that we've already seen instances of federal agencies and others taking and adapting the model. I mentioned that there's a whole group in Puerto Rico that has now really taken and run with it fairly early on. I think around 2019, if I remember correctly. There was also work by the Department of Health and Human Services. They developed a whole model just for work at HHS, really based very much on the Opportunity Project. And it was the same kinds of elements. It was bringing in users, bringing in technical folks, bringing in civil society partners. They also have found that it's very helpful to organize these projects thematically. They call these projects sprints, by the way. A sprint for them is a 12 to 14 week exercise, which is a little different from the way sprints are sometimes defined in agile development, but that's how they use it. So HHS, for example, did a whole sprint that was a whole bunch of projects around the use of AI in health. In a similar kind of way, the Opportunity Project itself has done a lot of thematic sprints on areas including education, geodata, workforce, and so on. And when we talked to them, what we learned was that even though they had gotten away from that model a bit in the last couple of years, they're really now planning to go back to that approach because it has been so effective. I think in terms of, though, the lessons for federal agencies, I think it's that this collaborative model can be extremely effective, and that technical folks, civil society folks, and definitely these user groups are really interested and eager to cooperate when you have a framework that enables them to do so in a really efficient way. And all of this is ultimately based on agile development models, which they've adapted and adopted, I think, in really creative ways.
Are these projects a coalition of the willing? People get together and just volunteer to do this kind of work? Is there a resource structure behind it?
It has, by and large, been a coalition of the willing with people. I would say it's sort of enlightened self-interest. One thing that came out of this was a whole top city. They go by TOP, the Opportunity Project, a whole top cities project that was done by the Beck Center at Georgetown, because they began working with cities who had something to gain from it. One of the questions is, how do you sustain this work? So there have been some cases where for-profit companies have gotten a product out of it that they can then use. My Sidewalk was one example. But in other cases, I think there is still some work to be done to figure out how to make these projects sustainable afterwards. But I think the creative process is one that can engage people on the basis of interest and voluntarism, and more important, seeing what the benefits can be for themselves.
That's really interesting. And I think about so many of the issues that we're facing today in the governance space that are cross-sector, cross-boundary, really challenging, where this kind of model might be especially useful. What kind of projects is TOP working on today?
Well, I'm not quite sure what their next themes are going to be. I think what they're working on now, among other things, is doing their own analysis of the last 10 years. They've been very effective. You mentioned communication earlier. They've been very effective in doing what they call demo days. These were originally in person. They moved them online during COVID. But I expect that this year we'll see both some reports from them and some convenings that really get the message out. And I think they're very focused right now on celebrating 10 years of success and communicating the success and the model to as many people as they can. And we've been very, very lucky to be able to talk a lot and work with the team to understand their work. They're doing phenomenal work, and we're just glad that we could put something together that helps to publicize it.
Well, you're certainly an advocate of open data there at Code. What role do you think that open data and agile development will play in shaping the next generation of public sector innovation?
I hope a huge role. When we wrote this paper about TOP in 2019, they were an emerging model of agile development. I think there's all kinds of work on agile now going on all over the federal government. So that's really become almost a given, I think, in many places. And open data in a similar way. So I started Code in 2015 when just the idea of open data was still an emerging concept. I think it's also now very much taken for granted. And I think the real issues for the next generation are going to be, how do we apply this kind of technical approach and how do we apply these kinds of data resources in ways that mesh with AI development, with all the technical innovations that we're seeing. But I think there's really great opportunity ahead.
Joel Gurin is the president and founder of Code. We'll post this interview and a link to his new paper at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. You can also subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former senior advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization, really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down and work hard, et cetera. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, et cetera, even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge, and how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life, like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.